At Silver Lantern, a high-end restaurant known for its exquisite ambiance and gourmet meals, the staff turned away Dr. Adrian Hayes, a black surgeon, judging him solely by his appearance. But when Adrian returned the following evening, no one could have predicted the impact he was about to make. Before diving into this transformative story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming content. Dr. Adrian Hayes collapsed into the worn leather chair in the hospital's quiet lounge, his surgical cap still perched on his head. The wall clock's hands pointed well past midnight. Closing his eyes for a moment, Adrian let the weight of the day sink into his aching body. It had been a grueling shift filled with back-to-back surgeries, each one testing his expertise and stamina. As he sat there catching his breath, Adrian's thoughts wandered to one of his recent patients, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, a well-known philanthropist whose life had hung by a thread just a week ago. The procedure had been tense, fraught with complications, but in the end, Adrian's steady hands and years of training had prevailed. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't Margaret's wealth or prominence that mattered to Adrian. It was knowing she would reunite with her family, that they wouldn't have to endure a devastating loss. That belief in the sanctity of every life was why Adrian had pursued medicine in the first place, to help others, no matter their background or circumstances. Adrian's mind wandered further back to his own childhood. He grew up in Meadow Ridge, a neighborhood where dreams like becoming a doctor were often dismissed as impossible. He could still remember the skeptical glances, the murmured doubts, and outright dismissals he faced whenever he spoke of his ambitions. Yet, he had pushed through, driven by a relentless desire to prove the naysayers wrong and make a real difference. Now, as Dr. Adrian Hayes, he found himself living that dream every day. From treating a homeless man suffering from frostbite to performing intricate surgeries for high-profile patients, Adrian approached every case with equal care and dedication. To him, every life was equally valuable, equally deserving of his best effort. As he peeled off his surgical gown, a wave of satisfaction washed over him. Yes, he was exhausted. Yes, his feet ached and his back protested every step. But the knowledge that his work had given families hope, that he'd offered second chances, made every moment worthwhile. Gathering his things, Adrian prepared to head home for a few hours of rest before returning to the hospital. As he exited the building, the cool night air greeted him like a refreshing balm after the sterile confines of the operating room. Adrian paused, weighing his options. Most nights, he would head straight home to collapse into bed. But tonight felt different. He'd earned a treat, hadn't he? A small indulgence after such an intense day? His colleagues had often sung praises of a fancy downtown restaurant, Silver Lantern. Renowned for its world-class cuisine and warm ambiance, it promised an experience that could melt away even the heaviest of burdens. With a small nod of self-approval, Adrian decided he would finally visit. Still dressed in his scrubs, Adrian ventured through the lively city streets. The sidewalks were buzzing, even at this late hour, with pedestrians clad in sleek suits and elegant dresses. He noticed the curious glances thrown his way as he walked, no doubt questioning why a man in hospital attire was mingling amidst the chic nightlife. But Adrian squared his shoulders and pressed on. He'd earned this. Finally, he reached Silver Lantern. Its soft golden lights spilled invitingly onto the cobblestone street, casting a warm glow that seemed to beckon him inside. Adrian took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy glass door, and stepped into the restaurant's lavish interior. To him, it was just a meal, a simple moment of indulgence after a hard day's work. But for the people inside, this moment was about to become something much greater. Inside the Silver Lantern, the atmosphere radiated sophistication. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a soft, golden glow, their light reflecting off the polished silverware and crisp white tablecloths. The gentle clinking of wine glasses and murmured conversations created an ambiance of refinement. Dr. Adrian Hayes stepped up to the host's stand, suddenly acutely aware of his wrinkled scrubs and weary demeanor. A young man in a sleek black suit stood behind the podium, his polished appearance a stark contrast to Adrian's. "Good evening, sir," the host said, his tone polite but his eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Do you have a reservation?" Adrian shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. "I just finished a long shift at the hospital and thought I'd treat myself to a nice dinner. Do you have any tables available?" The host's gaze flickered nervously around the room before settling back on Adrian's scrubs. He seemed unsure, his polite smile wavering as he weighed his response. As Adrian stood waiting, he noticed a subtle shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. The warmth he had admired from outside now felt replaced by a chill of discomfort. Nearby staff exchanged quick glances, their expressions betraying a mixture of skepticism and unease. Adrian's attire, far from the tailored suits and elegant dresses around him, drew silent judgment. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," the host said at last, clearing his throat awkwardly. His voice carried a note of condescension, despite the veneer of politeness. "We're fully booked for the evening." Adrian felt a pang of disappointment but masked it with a measured smile. He had faced worse in his life and career. This was just another moment to rise above. "I understand," he said, his tone calm and composed. "I know it's last minute, but is there any chance you could fit me in? Even a small table for a quick meal?" The host's lips thinned, and he avoided meeting Adrian's eyes. He glanced around again, though Adrian could clearly see several empty tables scattered throughout the restaurant. "I'm afraid not," the host replied firmly. "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable at one of the casual places down the street." The words, though delivered with a facade of courtesy, struck a familiar chord in Adrian's chest. He'd encountered this kind of treatment before, yet it never ceased to sting. However, he refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he drew strength from the memories of the lives he'd saved earlier that day. Those victories mattered more than this moment of prejudice. "I see," Adrian said quietly. He paused, carefully considering his next words. He wanted to make a point, not create a scene. "You know," he began, his voice steady, "I just wrapped up a 12-hour shift at the hospital. I saved a few lives today. I thought I'd reward myself with a good meal, but I suppose my appearance doesn't quite meet your standards." Before the host could respond, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit strode over, the sound of his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. His commanding presence immediately drew the attention of nearby diners. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his tone authoritative and smooth. The host straightened, his demeanor suddenly more nervous. "Mr. Sterling," he began, addressing the manager, "this gentleman was just leaving. I've explained that we're fully booked." Mr. Sterling's eyes swept over Adrian, lingering briefly on his wrinkled scrubs and worn shoes. A frown creased his forehead, and his tone turned dismissive. "I see," he said curtly. "I'm sorry, sir, but as my colleague mentioned, we simply don't have any available tables." Adrian glanced around the room again, his gaze landing on the unoccupied tables scattered throughout the dining area. He felt frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior, but kept his voice measured. "With all due respect," Adrian said, gesturing to the vacant tables, "I can see at least 3 empty tables from where I'm standing." Mr. Sterling's expression hardened. "Those tables are reserved for our regular patrons," he said flatly. "We're far too busy to accommodate walk-ins tonight, particularly those who aren't dressed appropriately." The manager's words hung in the air, cold and unyielding. Adrian stood tall, his disappointment clear but his dignity intact. Though the sting of rejection was familiar, he resolved not to let it define him. This was not the end of the evening. It was merely the beginning of a lesson that neither the Silver Lantern nor its staff would soon forget. Dr. Adrian Hayes felt his cheeks flush under the weight of the manager's words, but he refused to let shame settle in. He had fought too hard, overcome too many obstacles, and helped too many people to let this moment define him. "I understand your concerns about attire," Adrian said evenly, his voice calm yet firm, "but I've just finished a long shift at the hospital. I was hoping to enjoy a nice meal after a day of saving lives." Mr. Sterling, the manager, raised an eyebrow at Adrian's words, but his rigid stance didn't waver. "That's admirable work," he replied with a curt nod. "But we have standards to maintain." Their voices carried through the elegant dining room, catching the attention of nearby patrons. The room filled with hushed whispers and furtive glances. Some diners appeared uncomfortable, while others seemed indignant on Adrian's behalf. An older couple at a nearby table exchanged concerned looks. The The woman leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made him nod solemnly. Meanwhile, Adrian could feel the weight of their stares, some filled with pity, others laced with judgment. Standing tall despite the tightness in his chest, Adrian resolved to handle the situation with dignity. The unfairness of it all gnawed at him, but he refused to let it break his composure. He took a deep breath and locked eyes with Mr. Sterling and the host, whose faces were a mix of discomfort and disdain. "I understand," Adrian said softly, his tone tinged with resignation. "Thank you for your time." With those words, he turned and walked out of the Silver Lantern. The cool night air hit him as he stepped onto the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere he had just left behind. His shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of what had transpired. As Adrian walked away, he could hear the faint murmur of voices from within the restaurant. He didn't look back, choosing instead to focus on moving forward, one step at a time. Yet, the scene replayed over and over in his mind, the sting of rejection and prejudice leaving an ache in his chest. Eventually, Adrian found himself in a quiet park nearby. He sat down on a weathered bench, tilting his head up to the sky, where stars twinkled faintly through the city's glow. Their quiet beauty offered a small measure of solace, but the question lingering in his heart refused to fade. "Why does this still happen?" he whispered into the night, his voice barely audible. As Adrian sat in the stillness, his thoughts turned to his patients. He remembered the gratitude in Margaret Ellis's eyes after her life-saving surgery. He thought of the countless other lives he had touched, people from all walks of life, each one deserving of care and compassion. A quiet determination began to take shape within him. Adrian knew he had a choice. Let this incident weigh him down, or use it as fuel to inspire change. "I can't change their minds," Adrian murmured to himself, "but I can keep being the best doctor and person I can be." With renewed resolve, Adrian rose from the bench. His steps were steadier now, each one fueled by a newfound purpose. Ideas began to swirl in his mind, starting a mentorship program for underprivileged youth interested in medicine, or leading initiatives to promote diversity at the hospital. The pain of discrimination still lingered, but alongside it was a spark of hope, a belief that every act of kindness and every life saved could bring the world closer to understanding and equality. When Adrian finally arrived at his modest apartment, his steps were heavy but purposeful. He climbed the stairs, pushed open the door, and hung up his coat. Sinking into his favorite armchair, he let out a long, weary sigh. The evening's events replayed in his mind, but this time his focus shifted to the broader picture. He thought of the years he had spent striving to become a doctor, the endless nights of studying, the grueling hours of his residency, and the constant need to prove himself. One memory stood out above the rest. His first day as a surgical intern. Adrian had walked into the hospital brimming with excitement and determination, eager to begin his journey. But as he approached the nurse's station, he overheard a conversation that made his heart sink. "Are you sure he's supposed to be here?" one nurse had whispered to another. "I thought we were getting a new surgical intern today." Adrian had taken a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and approached with a warm smile. "Good morning," he had said confidently. "I'm Dr. Adrian Hayes, your new surgical intern." The surprise on their faces had been unmistakable, a look he had become all too familiar with over the years. But Adrian had pushed through, proving himself time and again through his skill, compassion, and unyielding dedication. As he sat in his living room that night, Adrian reminded himself of those hard-fought victories. They were proof that even in the face of prejudice, he could rise above. And now, as he prepared for another day of saving lives, Adrian knew this latest encounter would not define him. Instead, it would serve as a stepping stone towards something greater, a chance to inspire change and continue his mission of healing hearts, both in and out of the operating room. He had encountered skepticism and doubt at nearly every stage of his career, but he refused to let it deter him. Another memory surfaced from his residency. During a particularly complex surgery, the lead surgeon had unexpectedly collapsed. Without hesitation, Adrian had stepped in, taking control of the procedure and completing it flawlessly. In the aftermath, he overheard murmurs of surprise from the surgical team. "I can't believe someone like him handled that," one voice had whispered, the words slicing through Adrian like a blade. His eyes misted slightly as these moments replayed in his mind. Each had been a battle, not just to prove his skills, but to assert his humanity and worth. Yet for every painful memory, there were countless others that filled his heart with joy. The gratitude of his patients, the lives he had saved, and the families he had comforted. These were the moments that made every struggle worthwhile. As the night wore on, Adrian reflected, not with defeat, but with renewed determination. Every obstacle had forged him into the doctor and person he was today, stronger and more resolved to make a difference. The next morning, Adrian arrived at the hospital, a familiar sense of purpose driving his steps. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air as he walked through the corridors, greeting his colleagues with a warm smile. Here, in these hallways, his dedication and skill were what truly mattered. His first case of the day was a challenging one, a young boy with a congenital heart defect. As Adrian scrubbed in, the memory of the restaurant incident flickered briefly in his mind, but he quickly pushed it aside. In the operating room, all distractions melted away. Adrian's focus narrowed to the delicate task before him. His hands moved with precision and confidence as he worked to give the child a chance at a full and healthy life. Hours later, Adrian emerged from the operating room, tired but triumphant. The surgery had been a success, and he could already imagine the joy on the parents' faces when he delivered the good news. After a quick break, Adrian resumed his rounds. He stopped by one particular patient's room, Margaret Ellis, the high-profile philanthropist whose life he had saved just days earlier. Adrian was curious to see how she was recovering and to bid her farewell as she prepared to leave the hospital. When he entered, Margaret's face lit up. "Dr. Hayes," she exclaimed, her voice warm with gratitude. "I was hoping you'd stop by." Adrian approached her bedside with a smile, checking her vitals as they spoke. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Ellis?" he asked. "Much better, thanks to you," she replied, her eyes shining with appreciation. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You've given me a second chance at life." A wave of warmth spread through Adrian's chest. Moments like this were the reason he had chosen this path, to make a difference in people's lives, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "I'm just glad I could help," he said softly. "Your recovery is coming along nicely. Be sure to come back for your follow-up appointment." As they chatted, Adrian found himself forgetting the sting of the previous evening's rejection. In this moment, he was reminded of the impact he could make, the lives he could touch. It was all the validation he needed. As Margaret prepared to leave the hospital, she overheard two nurses talking in the hallway. "Did you hear what happened to Dr. Hayes yesterday?" one nurse whispered. "He was turned away from the Silver Lantern, wouldn't even give him a table." Margaret paused, her expression darkening as she absorbed their words. It was unthinkable that a man as kind, skilled, and selfless as Dr. Hayes could be treated so poorly. Her gratitude deepened as she left the hospital, already beginning to form a plan to ensure Adrian's story didn't end there. Dr. Hayes was kind, selfless, and deserving of far better treatment than what he had received. He had treated her with dignity and respect, without a second thought about her wealth or status. It was time to return the favor. On the ride home, Margaret began forming a plan. She was well connected in the city's social elite, her influence reaching far and wide. While she rarely used her position for personal matters, this was a cause she deemed worthy. "Driver," she called out, her voice firm, "take me to the Silver Lantern, please, not home." The car veered toward the upscale restaurant, and as soon as it arrived, Margaret stepped out with determination radiating from her every step. She marched directly to the concierge's desk, where a young staff member greeted her with wide eyes. "I need to speak with the manager," Margaret said firmly. "It's urgent." The staff member, recognizing her instantly, nodded and quickly fetched Mr. Sterling. As Margaret waited, she looked around at the luxurious decor and bustling staff. Her resolve only grew stronger. When Mr. Sterling arrived, he greeted her with a respectful bow. "Mrs. Ellis, what an unexpected pleasure. How can I assist you today?" Margaret wasted no time launching into an explanation of what had happened. She spoke passionately about Dr. Hayes, his incredible skill, his unwavering compassion, and the disrespect he had endured at their restaurant. Her words grew more impassioned with each sentence, her voice steady but filled with conviction. By the time she finished, Mr. Sterling's expression was a mixture of shame and concern. "I had no idea," he murmured. "This is deeply troubling." "I want to host an event," Margaret declared, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "A celebration for the city's unsung heroes, and I want it to take place here, at the Silver Lantern." Mr. Sterling's face lit up at the suggestion. "Of course, Mrs. Ellis, we would be honored to host such an event." As they began discussing the details, Margaret felt a swell of satisfaction. This wouldn't just be a dinner. It would be a statement. A way to shine a light on people like Dr. Hayes, who worked tirelessly to make the world a better place. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with determination. "I'll need the entire venue for tonight," she said. "It must be a private event. Do you understand?" "Absolutely," Mr. Sterling replied, his pen flying across his notepad. "We'll make it happen." The restaurant staff immediately sprang into action. Waiters straightened their uniforms, the kitchen staff began pulling out their finest ingredients, and the sommelier carefully selected the best wines from their collection. The air buzzed with excitement, though none of them knew the true purpose of the event. Margaret watched the flurry of activity with a small, satisfied smile. Her mind lingered on Dr. Hayes and the way he had been treated just yesterday. Soon, she thought, the wrongs of that night would be righted. "Is there anything else you need, Mrs. Ellis?" Mr. Sterling asked, his pen hovering above his notepad. Margaret paused thoughtfully before nodding. "Yes, one more thing. I'd like a special table prepared in the center of the restaurant, the best table in the house. It should be impeccable." Mr. Sterling raised his eyebrows slightly but quickly composed himself. "Of course, Mrs. Ellis. We'll ensure it's perfect." As preparations continued, Margaret leaned back in her chair, watching the staff bustle around with a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. This night would be more than just an event. It would be a moment to honor those who deserved recognition and to teach a valuable lesson about kindness and respect. Tonight, she thought, would be a night to remember. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Dr. Adrian Hayes' phone buzzed with an unexpected message. He glanced at the screen to find a message from Margaret Ellis, the philanthropist whose life he had saved just days earlier. His brow furrowed as he read the invitation, a dinner in his honor that very evening. Adrian blinked in surprise, rereading the words. "A dinner for me?" he thought, a mixture of curiosity and unease swirling within him. The events at the Silver Lantern the previous night were still fresh in his mind. The idea of returning to a formal dining setting made him hesitant. But Margaret's words were warm and heartfelt. "Dr. Hayes," the message read, "your skill and compassion have touched so many lives. Please allow us to show our appreciation tonight at 7 p.m. at the Silver Lantern." Adrian's heart skipped a beat. The Silver Lantern, the same restaurant that had turned him away. He stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of him wanted to decline to avoid any potential discomfort, but another part, the part of him that always chose to see the best in people, urged him to accept. With a deep breath, Adrian typed his response. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. I would be honored to attend." As the hours ticked by, Adrian prepared for the evening. He swapped his scrubs for a simple but elegant suit, the nicest one he owned. Standing before the mirror, he adjusted his tie, his thoughts a whirlwind of nerves and curiosity. What would the night bring? Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Ellis was orchestrating far more than a simple dinner. She had spent the day reaching out to others whose lives Adrian had saved over the years. Each call was met with enthusiasm and gratitude as she shared her plan. "We're going to celebrate Dr. Hayes and the impact he's had on our community," she explained to each person. "Your presence would mean the world to him." One by one, they agreed, eager to show their appreciation for the doctor who had given them a second chance at life. With every confirmation, Margaret's heart swelled. Tonight, she thought with satisfaction, will be a night Dr. Hayes will never forget. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Silver Lantern was a hive of activity. Waiters rushed to polish silverware and adjust table settings, while the head chef barked orders in the kitchen, determined to outdo himself. "This needs to be perfect," the chef declared, tasting his signature bisque. "This will leave them speechless." In the dining area, Mr. Sterling, the manager, paced nervously, his sharp eyes scanning the room for any flaws. "Everything must be flawless," he muttered, straightening a slightly crooked painting on the wall. "Margaret Ellis is our most esteemed patron, and tonight's guest of honor could make or break our reputation." At the entrance, the host, Linda, carefully arranged fresh flowers, leaning toward a colleague to whisper, "I heard she's bringing someone very important, maybe a celebrity or a politician." Mr. Sterling puffed out his chest with pride. "Whoever it is, they'll receive the finest service the Silver Lantern has to offer. We don't turn away important people here," he added, oblivious to the irony of his statement. In the kitchen, the chef grinned with satisfaction as he ladled soup into ornate bowls. "This will knock their socks off," he declared to his team. Outside, valets stood ready, anticipating the arrival of luxury cars. Inside, the matter practiced his warmest, most gracious smile, eager to greet Margaret and her mystery guest. As the clock edged closer to 7 p.m., the anticipation in the restaurant was palpable. The staff gathered for a final pep talk from Mr. Sterling. "Listen carefully," he began, his tone firm yet tinged with excitement. "Tonight is critical. This event could cement our reputation or ruin it. I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you." A chorus of "Yes, sir" echoed back as the team dispersed to their positions, each determined to deliver excellence. What none of them realized was the profound twist awaiting them. The guest of honor was none other than the man they had dismissed just the night before. Tonight, Adrian Hayes would walk through those very doors, and the lesson about kindness, respect, and the true measure of worth was about to begin. "Margaret Ellis isn't just any guest," Mr. Sterling declared to his team. "She's practically royalty in this city, and whoever she's bringing must be equally important. I want everyone on their best behavior. Treat every guest like they're the most important person in the world. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," came the unified response as the staff dispersed, eager to meet the manager's high expectations. Little did they know that the evening would deliver a lesson in humility and kindness that none of them would forget. The guest of honor, Dr. Adrian Hayes, was about to walk through their doors, this time accompanied by the very people whose lives he had saved. As the clock struck 7, Adrian approached the Silver Lantern. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and khakis, his usual attire when not in scrubs, he took a deep breath before pushing open the heavy door. The host, Linda, greeted him with a bright smile that quickly faltered as she recognized him. Her eyes widened in panic, and she waved frantically toward Mr. Sterling, who was stationed nearby. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake," Linda stammered, stepping in front of Adrian to block his path. "We're closed for a private event tonight." Adrian furrowed his brow in confusion. "I was invited by Margaret Ellis," he said calmly, though he couldn't ignore the familiar ache in his chest. Mr. Sterling hurried over, his face tightening into a mask of thinly veiled disdain. Now, what seems to be the problem here?" he asked, addressing Linda while purposefully ignoring Adrian. "This gentleman claims he was invited by Mrs. Ellis," Linda whispered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Mr. Sterling turned to Adrian, his lips curling into a forced smile. "Sir, I believe we've been through this before. This is a highly exclusive establishment, and we're hosting a very important event tonight. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Adrian felt a storm of emotions brewing within him. Hurt, frustration, and disappointment. But years of enduring similar moments had taught him to remain composed. "I understand your concern," he said softly, "but I assure you, I was invited. Perhaps you could check with Mrs. Ellis?" Mr. Sterling's expression hardened. He leaned in closer, his tone icy. "Now listen here," he hissed. "I don't know what game you're playing, but Mrs. Ellis would never associate with someone like—" "Someone like what, Mr. Sterling?" A sharp voice cut through the tension like a blade. The entire room froze as Margaret Ellis swept into the room, her navy dress flowing elegantly around her. Mr. Sterling's mouth fell open, his unfinished words dying on his lips. "Dr. Hayes, my dear!" Margaret exclaimed, her arms outstretched. "I'm so glad you could make it." She embraced Adrian warmly, placing a kiss on each cheek as the staff looked on in stunned silence. Mr. Sterling turned pale, while Linda appeared ready to faint. Margaret turned to the bewildered staff, her arm still linked with Adrian's. Her gaze was sharp but controlled. "What is going on here?" she demanded. "Why isn't our guest of honor being properly welcomed?" Guest of honor?" Mr. Sterling stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Ellis, there must be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Margaret interrupted firmly. She addressed the room, her voice carrying to every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Adrian Hayes. This entire event is in his honor." A ripple of surprised murmurs swept through the room as the weight of her words sank in. Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Hayes saved my life last week with his extraordinary skill and unwavering dedication. But that's not all. He has saved countless others, always treating every person with equal care and respect, regardless of their status or background." She gently squeezed Adrian's arm, her gratitude evident. "This dinner is my way of thanking him," she said, her eyes shining. "Not just for saving me, but for his commitment to helping others. He embodies compassion and selflessness in ways we should all aspire to." Adrian stood quietly, his emotions welling up. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he took in the room, some faces filled with awe, others with shame. For the staff of the Silver Lantern, the realization struck hard. The man they had dismissed was someone far greater than they had imagined. Tonight would not only celebrate Adrian Hayes but also serve as a profound reminder of the value of kindness, respect, and the immeasurable worth of every individual. The staff at the Silver Lantern shifted uncomfortably as Margaret Ellis's words echoed through the room. The weight of their earlier actions pressed heavily on their shoulders, their regret palpable. Margaret's gaze swept over Mr. Sterling and Linda, her disappointment impossible to miss. "I hope this serves as a lesson to us all," she said, her voice firm but composed. "We should never judge someone by their appearance or make assumptions about their worth." With a gentle gesture, Margaret guided Dr. Adrian Hayes to the head of the elegantly set table. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, the shame of their misjudgment burning brightly on their faces. Mr. Sterling avoided Adrian's gaze entirely, his eyes glued to the polished floor, while Linda blinked back tears. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to turn away a man who had saved countless lives. Now, the enormity of her mistake weighed heavily on her heart. Margaret's voice rang out, clear and strong, as she addressed the guests gathered around the table. "Friends, family, and honored guests," she began, "please take your seats. Tonight, we are here to celebrate a true hero among us." The guests, an eclectic mix of grateful patients and community members, settled into their chairs. Their eyes were fixed on Adrian, their expressions filled with admiration and curiosity. Margaret placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder, her voice thick with emotion as she continued. "Last week I lay on an operating table, my life hanging by a thread. The situation was dire, and hope seemed lost. But then Dr. Adrian Hayes stepped in." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "With steady hands and unwavering focus, Dr. Hayes performed a miracle. He didn't just save my life, he gave me a second chance." Adrian stood quietly, his humble demeanor contrasting sharply with the effusive praise being directed his way. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of those he had helped, the staff who had dismissed him, and the guests who now looked at him with newfound respect. "But that's not all," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Dr. Hayes has touched countless lives in this community. Whether rich or poor, famous or unknown, he treats everyone with the same compassion and care." As Margaret spoke, the staff members felt the full weight of their earlier actions. They had turned away a man who exemplified humanity at its best, all because of their prejudices and assumptions. When Margaret finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Then, slowly, a middle-aged man with a cane rose to his feet. His voice trembled as he began to speak. "Dr. Hayes saved my leg after a terrible accident," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "The other doctors wanted to amputate, but Dr. Hayes refused to give up. He worked tirelessly, and because of him, I can walk again." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. The staff, who had been quietly observing, listened intently, their faces a mix of awe and shame. Next, a young mother stood, cradling a baby in her arms. "This little one wouldn't be here if it weren't for Dr. Hayes," she said softly. He performed emergency surgery when I went into early labor. He saved both of our lives." As she spoke, the baby cooed softly, as if adding her own thanks. Linda, the hostess, felt a lump form in her throat. An elderly woman, her silver hair pinned neatly back, stood next. "Dr. Hayes didn't just heal my body," she said, her voice wavering. "He took the time to comfort me when I was scared. He has a gift for healing hearts as well as bodies." One by one, more patients rose to share their stories. A young boy spoke of playing soccer again after a complex knee surgery. A cancer survivor described beating the odds thanks to Adrian's unwavering dedication. A firefighter recounted returning to duty after Adrian saved him from a life-threatening injury. With each story, the atmosphere in the room became more charged with emotion. Tears flowed freely, both from the guests sharing their gratitude and the humbled staff absorbing the magnitude of Adrian's impact. Mr. Sterling, the manager, felt an overwhelming sense of shame settle over him. The realization of how wrong he had been was inescapable. He had judged Adrian based solely on his appearance, dismissing him without considering the profound ways this man had changed lives. The night was no longer just a celebration. It had become a powerful lesson in humanity, one that no one present would soon forget. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a heavy stone as he listened to the heartfelt tributes from Adrian's former patients. The restaurant staff stood in stunned silence, exchanging glances of disbelief and regret. The man they had so hastily turned away was not just a doctor. He was a hero, a beacon of hope for so many in their darkest moments. As the last patient finished sharing their story, all eyes turned to Adrian, who sat quietly at the head of the table. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and the room fell silent, waiting for him to speak. Slowly, Adrian stood, his shoulders straight but his demeanor humble. He cleared his throat, his voice soft but steady as he began. I don't know what to say," Adrian admitted, his words faltering slightly. "Mrs. Ellis and all of you, thank you. Your words mean more to me than I can ever express." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The staff watched him intently, their faces a mixture of awe and discomfort. "But please," Adrian continued, "don't think of me as anything special. I'm just doing my job, the job I love and feel privileged to do. Every day I help people, save lives. But I don't do it for recognition or praise. It's simply my duty as a doctor and as a human being." Margaret Ellis dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, nodding in agreement, as Adrian's words resonated with the room. The other guests listened intently, their faces shining with admiration. Adrian's gaze swept across the table, his voice growing warmer. "Each one of you," he said, gesturing to the patients who had shared their stories, "you're the real heroes. Your strength and courage in the face of illness and adversity. That's what inspires me to do my best every single day." As he spoke, the restaurant staff shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Sterling felt his face burn with shame, his regret mirrored in the eyes of Linda, the hostess who stood nearby. "I never expect anything in return for my work," Adrian continued, his voice now steady and clear. "The opportunity to help, to make a difference in someone's life. That's all the reward I need." His words hung in the air, filled with sincerity and humility. The contrast between Adrian's character and the way he had been treated in the restaurant just days ago was stark and undeniable. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, the discomfort palpable. They had judged him so harshly, so unfairly, and now they were witnessing firsthand the depth of his compassion and dedication. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the restaurant became a mixture of joy and unease. The guests continued to share their stories, each one painting an increasingly vivid picture of Adrian's kindness and skill. Laughter and tears flowed freely around the table, creating an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy. Meanwhile, the staff moved about the room, serving dishes and refilling glasses. Their movements were mechanical, their smiles strained. Every time they approached the table, snippets of conversation deepened their shame. Near the kitchen door, Mr. Sterling stood motionless, watching as Adrian laughed softly with Margaret Ellis. He noted the doctor's easy manner and genuine smile. The same smile he had dismissed just yesterday as unworthy of his establishment. Linda, balancing a tray of glasses, nearly dropped them as she overheard one guest describe how Adrian had stayed by their bedside all night during a difficult recovery. She remembered her own cold stare when Adrian had politely asked for a table and felt her stomach churn with guilt. In the kitchen, the head chef, who had peeked out to catch a glimpse of the commotion, froze in place, spatula in hand. His eyes locked on Adrian's face, and recognition hit him like a wave. He recalled nodding in agreement when Mr. Sterling had declared Adrian unsuitable for their restaurant. Now that moment replayed in his mind, each nod a painful reminder of his complicity. The realization spread among the staff like wildfire. They hadn't just dismissed a man. They had dismissed someone whose kindness, skill, and humanity far surpassed anything they had assumed. The once celebratory air of the restaurant had shifted into something far more profound, a reckoning. And as the evening unfolded, each member of the staff began to understand that this was a moment they would never forget. As the main course was served, Margaret Ellis rose to her feet once again, holding her glass high. Her voice carried across the room, clear and confident. "A toast to Dr. Adrian Hayes," she began, her words filled with warmth and reverence. "A man who sees beyond appearances and treats everyone with equal kindness and respect. We could all learn so much from his example." The guests responded enthusiastically, their voices joining in unison. "To Dr. Hayes!" they cheered, raising their glasses. Even the staff, caught in the moment, found themselves lifting their trays or whatever they held in hand, joining the toast almost instinctively. The sense of admiration in the room was infectious, but for the staff it came with a deep discomfort. Each story shared about Adrian's selflessness and skill felt like a spotlight on their earlier misjudgment. The weight of their actions hung heavily on their consciences. Mr. Sterling, who had been standing stiffly by the kitchen door, now seemed a shadow of his usual confident self. His face was pale, and his hands fidgeted at his sides as he watched Adrian interact with the guests. The same gentle smile and warm demeanor he had dismissed the day before now filled the room with light. Linda, the hostess, moved between tables with noticeably less poise than usual. Her hands trembled as she poured water, her eyes carefully avoiding contact with the guests. She couldn't stop replaying her cold, dismissive attitude when Adrian had politely asked for a table. The memory gnawed at her, and the weight of her regret grew heavier with every story she overheard. In the kitchen, the chef worked in silence, his earlier excitement about preparing a high-profile event long gone. Now, each anecdote about Adrian's compassion and dedication was a reminder of his own shallow assumptions. As the evening progressed, the staff found themselves listening intently to the stories being shared at the table. They heard about Adrian's late-night vigils at hospital bedsides, how he gently explained procedures to frightened children, and his unwavering commitment to treating every patient with equal care and respect. With each passing moment, the stark contrast between Adrian's character and their own behavior became painfully clear. The staff exchanged glances, seeing their own guilt mirrored in each other's eyes. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a profound lesson in humility, equality, and the harm of judging others based on appearances. Mr. Sterling felt a lump form in his throat as he overheard Margaret Ellis recount how Adrian had saved her life. He thought about how close he had come to turning this remarkable man away entirely, simply because he didn't fit the image of what Sterling considered a suitable guest for the Silver Lantern. As the dessert course was being prepared, Linda paused by the kitchen door, overwhelmed by the realization of how deeply their actions must have hurt Adrian. She began to wonder how many other extraordinary individuals they might have judged unfairly or mistreated over the years. The evening's reflections were interrupted by an unexpected commotion. A loud, desperate gasp echoed through the dining room, followed by the clatter of silverware hitting the floor. All eyes turned to the source of the noise, a young waiter named Ben, who had been part of the group that turned Adrian away the day before. Ben was clutching at his throat, his face turning a frightening shade of red as his eyes widened in panic. He had been sampling an appetizer in the kitchen when a piece of food lodged in his throat. Now he was choking, unable to breathe. For a moment, the room was frozen in silence as the gravity of the situation sank in. Then chaos erupted. Guests scrambled to their feet, chairs scraping loudly against the floor. Some called out for help, while others looked around helplessly, unsure of what to do. Mr. Sterling stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of shock and fear. Linda clapped her hands over her mouth, panic etched across her features. The other staff members hovered nearby, paralyzed by the unfolding emergency. Adrian, however, wasted no time. Without hesitation, he stood from his seat and moved swiftly toward Ben, his calm demeanor cutting through the chaos like a beacon of assurance. "Step aside," Adrian said firmly, his voice steady. "I've got this." The room held its collective breath as all eyes turned to the man they had come to honor, now stepping into action, once again proving the depth of his skill and compassion. Linda, the hostess, clasped her hands over her mouth, her wide eyes filled with terror. The other staff members stood frozen nearby, their faces pale with worry, unsure of what to do. The gravity of the situation rendered them helpless. Dr. Adrian Hayes' gaze fixed on Ben, the choking waiter. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on him. The very staff who had dismissed him just a day earlier now desperately needed his help. But Adrian didn't hesitate. Compassion and a desire to save lives were etched into his soul, and those instincts overrode everything else. As Adrian stood, the room collectively held its breath. The guests and staff alike remained frozen, watching as the man they had gathered to honor faced an unexpected emergency. Without a moment's delay, Adrian rushed to Ben's side. The panicked murmur of the crowd faded into silence as all eyes locked onto the unfolding drama. "I'm here to help," Adrian said softly, his voice steady and reassuring as he addressed Ben. "I'm going to perform the Heimlich maneuver. Stay calm." With practiced ease, Adrian positioned himself behind Ben, wrapping his arms firmly around the young waiter's waist. He placed one hand just above Ben's navel, clasping it with his other hand before delivering swift, forceful abdominal thrusts. The tension in the room was unbearable. Margaret Ellis clutched her hands together, her knuckles white as she watched, her face tight with worry. Mr. Sterling stood rooted in place, his expression a mixture of fear and shame. The other staff members huddled close, their earlier judgments forgotten in the face of their colleagues' dire situation. Adrian's focus never wavered as he continued the thrusts, his face calm yet concentrated. Ben's face, however, turned a deeper shade of red, his bulging eyes reflecting his rising panic. For a moment, it seemed as if Adrian's efforts might fail, and the room collectively braced for the worst. Then suddenly, a loud gasp broke the tension. A small piece of food shot from Ben's mouth, landing on the polished floor with a faint splat. Ben inhaled a deep, ragged breath, coughing and sputtering as air rushed back into his lungs. Adrian gently patted his back, his hands steadying the young waiter as he regained his breath. "You're okay now," Adrian said softly, his voice calm and soothing. "Just take slow, deep breaths." The room remained eerily quiet, everyone processing the gravity of what had just happened. All eyes remained fixed on Adrian and Ben. Ben, still gasping for air, turned to face Adrian, his eyes brimming with tears. He looked at the man he had helped turn away just the day before, overwhelmed by a mix of gratitude and shame. "Thank you," Ben whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. You saved my life." Adrian smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Ben's shoulder. "It's what I do," he replied simply. "Are you feeling better now?" Ben nodded weakly, and in that moment, the spell of silence broke. The room erupted into applause, the sound of clapping mingling with sighs of relief and murmurs of amazement. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, overcome with emotion as she witnessed Adrian's selflessness firsthand. Ben, still recovering, looked at Adrian with tears streaming down his face. His voice trembled as he tried to speak, the words catching in his throat. He stammered, swallowing hard against the discomfort. "Dr. Hayes, I'm so sorry for everything, the way we treated you yesterday. It was unforgivable." Adrian's warm eyes met Ben's, filled with nothing but understanding and kindness. He gently placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, steadying him. "It's okay," Adrian said softly, his voice calm and forgiving. "You don't need to apologize. I'm just glad you're all right." "No," Ben replied, shaking his head as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "It's not okay. We judged you without knowing who you were, and I can't undo that." Adrian gave Ben's shoulder a gentle squeeze, his voice steady and full of compassion. "What's important is that you're safe now," he said. "We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we grow from them." Ben nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and remorse. The room's earlier unease seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of awe for Adrian's unwavering dedication to helping others, no matter the circumstances. The evening's tone had shifted once again. What began as a celebration of Adrian's achievements had now transformed into something far more profound, a powerful reminder of the strength of kindness, forgiveness, and the enduring impact of compassion. Ben's voice trembled as he looked at Dr. Adrian Hayes, his face flushed with a mix of gratitude and shame. "We were wrong, so wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And now you've saved my life." The room was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the emotional exchange. Near the kitchen door, Mr. Sterling, the manager, stood with his face a mask of regret and embarrassment. Adrian offered a gentle, forgiving smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "What's important," he said softly, "is that you're safe now. That's all that matters to me." Ben wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still trying to process the kindness being shown to him. How can you be so forgiving after what we did?" he asked, his voice quivering. Adrian took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room to meet the eyes of the staff and guests alike. His voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed restaurant. "We all make mistakes," Adrian said. "What matters is how we learn from them and grow. Your apology shows you've already started that process." Ben nodded, a small smile breaking through his tears. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes, not just for saving my life, but for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." Adrian patted Ben's shoulder gently, his smile warm and reassuring. "You're welcome," he replied. "Now, why don't you sit down and have some water? You've been through a lot tonight." The rest of the staff, still shaken by the near-tragic incident, remained frozen for a moment, as if under a spell. Then, one by one, they began to move toward Adrian, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and gratitude. Linda, the hostess who had turned Adrian away the day before, was the first to step forward. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Hayes," she said, tears brimming in her eyes, I don't know how to express how sorry I am. The way we treated you yesterday was inexcusable." Adrian turned to her, his kind eyes meeting hers. His gentle smile radiated warmth, easing some of the tension in the room. "It's all right, Linda," he said softly. "We all make mistakes. What's important is that we learn from them." Encouraged by his response, the other staff members began to approach, each with their own heartfelt apology. Mr. Sterling, the manager, stepped forward next, his usual air of authority replaced by genuine remorse. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you the deepest apology. My behavior was unacceptable. I judged you based on your appearance, and I was so terribly wrong." Adrian nodded, his expression calm and understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I appreciate your honesty." One by one, the apologies continued. Adrian listened patiently to each staff member, his face a picture of compassion and grace. He didn't interrupt or show a trace of bitterness. Instead, he accepted each apology with the same kindness and dignity that had defined him throughout the evening. The last to approach was Jake, a young busboy who had been quietly observing the entire evening. He looked up at Adrian, his wide eyes filled with admiration. "Dr. Hayes," Jake said, his voice shaky, I want to be like you when I grow up. Not just a doctor, but someone who can forgive like that. How do you do it?" Adrian's smile widened, touched by the boy's sincerity. He placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "It's not always easy," he admitted, "but I've learned that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. Forgiveness frees you to move forward and create positive change." Margaret Ellis watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with pride. The staff's genuine remorse and Adrian's gracious forgiveness had created a profound moment of transformation. She knew this was an opportunity that couldn't go unacknowledged. Clearing her throat gently, she stepped forward, drawing the room's attention. Her eyes sparkled with emotion as she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and strong, "what we've witnessed here tonight is nothing short of extraordinary. Dr. Adrian Hayes has shown us the true meaning of compassion and forgiveness." The room, still filled with the echoes of heartfelt apologies, hung on her every word. Adrian's presence had turned an ordinary dinner into a life-changing lesson for everyone in attendance. Margaret Ellis paused, allowing her words to resonate. The room was utterly silent, every pair of eyes locked on her. Yesterday, she said, her voice steady yet emotional, this man was turned away from this very restaurant. Today he saved the life of one of your own without hesitation, and now he stands here, forgiving each of you with a grace that takes my breath away. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. Dr. Adrian Hayes's dedication to helping others, regardless of who they are or how they've treated him, should inspire us all. He shows us that true strength isn't in how we judge others, but in how we treat them, especially when they've wronged us. Margaret turned to Adrian, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Adrian, your compassion knows no bounds. You haven't just saved countless lives with your medical expertise, you've taught us all how to heal hearts and minds with kindness. Turning back to address the staff and guests, Margaret's voice grew more passionate. Let this be a lesson for us all. We must strive to see beyond appearances and treat everyone with the respect and dignity they deserve. Dr. Hayes has shown us that even in the face of prejudice and discrimination, it's possible to respond with love and understanding. Her words lingered in the air, wrapping the room in a reflective hush. Then a man in a sharp suit stepped forward from the back of the room. It was Mr. Johnson, the owner of the Silver Lantern. His face was etched with shame and regret as he approached Adrian. Clearing his throat, Mr. Johnson began, his voice shaky but determined. Dr. Hayes, he said, his eyes earnest, I can't express how deeply sorry I am for the way you were treated in my establishment. Adrian turned to face him, his expression calm and attentive. The room collectively held its breath, waiting to see how the moment would unfold. What happened to you was unacceptable, Mr. Johnson continued, his voice growing steadier. As the owner, I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff, but more than that, I'm ashamed that such behavior could occur under my watch. He paused, taking a deep, steadying breath before addressing everyone in the room. This incident has opened my eyes. It's clear that we've failed, not just Dr. Hayes, but potentially many others who have walked through our doors. Turning back to Adrian, Mr. Johnson's eyes shone with sincerity. Dr. Hayes, he said, I make this pledge to you and to everyone here. Starting today, we will implement comprehensive training for all our staff on inclusivity and respect. We will ensure that no one is ever mistreated in this establishment based on their appearance or any other factor. His voice cracked with emotion as he continued. We will work tirelessly to create an environment where everyone feels welcome and valued. Your forgiveness and grace, Dr. Hayes, have shown us the path forward. We have a lot of work to do, but I promise you, we will do better. Adrian nodded, a small but genuine smile of appreciation crossing his face. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment palpable. Mr. Johnson's words hung in the air, a promise of change and a testament to the transformative power of Adrian's compassion. Adrian's gaze softened as he listened to the heartfelt apology. Finally, he stepped forward, extending his hand to the restaurant owner. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, Adrian said, his voice warm and sincere. I appreciate your apology and your commitment to change. It takes courage to admit mistakes and even more to take action to correct them. Relief washed over Mr. Howard Johnson's face as he clasped Adrian's hand. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a budding sense of hope and possibility. Adrian continued, his tone thoughtful and encouraging. You have an opportunity here, not just to correct what went wrong, but to set an example for others. Change takes time, but every step forward makes a difference. As the two men shook hands, a ripple of quiet applause began to spread through the room. The staff, who had been watching with bated breath, began to exchange hopeful glances. For the first time that night, a sense of possibility filled the air. It wasn't just a pledge for inclusivity, it was a moment of transformation, and everyone present could feel it. Dr. Adrian Hayes smiled warmly as he spoke, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. If you'd like, I'd be happy to assist with some of those training sessions. As a doctor, I've witnessed how crucial it is to treat everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. Mr. Johnson, the owner of the Silver Lantern, looked at Adrian with wide-eyed gratitude. That would be incredibly generous of you, Dr. Hayes. We would be honored to have your guidance. Adrian nodded, then paused for a moment, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. You know, he began, there might be another way for your restaurant to make a positive impact on our community. Intrigued, Mr. Johnson leaned in, eager to hear more. Adrian's voice grew more animated as he shared his idea. Have you ever considered donating meals to hospital workers or people in need? Many of my colleagues work long hours, often skipping meals, and there are so many in our community who struggle to put food on the table. Mr. Johnson's face lit up with enthusiasm. That's a brilliant idea, Dr. Hayes. We could start a program to provide meals to hospital staff and local shelters. It would be a meaningful way to give back and show our appreciation for the hard work of healthcare professionals like you. Adrian's smile widened, clearly moved by the owner's eagerness. I think that could make a real difference, he said softly. It's not just about the food. It's about showing people that they matter, that they're seen and valued. Mr. Johnson's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he nodded vigorously. You're absolutely right, Dr. Hayes. We'll begin the meal donation program immediately. It's the least we can do to give back to this community. The restaurant staff, who had been listening intently, began to nod in agreement. Their expressions were a mix of shame and admiration as they absorbed the weight of the moment. One of the waiters stepped forward hesitantly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Dr. Hayes, he said softly, I can't express how sorry I am for the way we treated you. Your kindness, it's just incredible. You're teaching us so much more than how to run a restaurant. Adrian smiled warmly at the young man, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We all have room to grow and learn, he replied gently. What matters is that we're willing to do better. The staff murmured their agreement, their faces reflecting newfound respect and humility. It became clear to everyone in the room that this moment wasn't just about correcting a mistake. It was a profound lesson in human dignity and compassion. Margaret Ellis, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. Her voice, filled with pride, broke the silence. I think we've all learned something valuable tonight, she said. Dr. Hayes, you've shown us what true grace and forgiveness look like. You've taken a moment of injustice and turned it into an opportunity for growth and community service. The room fell silent once more as everyone reflected on her words. The staff exchanged glances, then looked back at Adrian, their expressions a mixture of awe and determination. It was clear they weren't just inspired to change their professional behavior, they wanted to become better people. Clearing his throat, Mr. Johnson spoke with newfound purpose. Dr. Hayes, Mrs. Ellis, everyone, I promise you, this is only the beginning. We're going to transform this restaurant into a place that truly serves and uplifts our community. The group nodded in agreement, a palpable sense of transformation filling the air. What had started as a celebration of Adrian's medical achievements had become something far greater, a lesson in humanity that none of them would soon forget. As the evening drew to a close, the guests began to filter out of the restaurant. But before leaving, each one took a moment to personally thank Adrian, eager to express their gratitude one last time. The atmosphere had undergone a remarkable transformation. What had started as a night tinged with guilt and shame had blossomed into something truly beautiful, a sense of hope and unity that touched everyone present. Margaret Ellis was the first to approach Adrian. Her eyes shone with admiration as she reached out to clasp his hands. Dr. Hayes, she said softly, you've changed all of us tonight. Thank you, not just for your skill as a doctor, but for your heart as a person. Adrian's gentle smile and quiet humility reflected the profound impact he had made, not only on the patients he had saved, but on an entire room of people who now understood the power of compassion and forgiveness. One by one, the other guests stepped forward. A young man whose life Adrian had saved in a car accident, an elderly woman who had undergone a high-risk heart surgery. Each person had a story to share, a heartfelt moment of gratitude to offer. Meanwhile, the restaurant staff watched these interactions quietly from the sidelines. They were deeply moved, witnessing firsthand the profound impact Adrian had on so many lives. It reinforced their commitment to embrace change and strive to do better. As the final guests bid their goodbyes, Ben, the waiter who had choked earlier that evening, approached Adrian once more. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice was steady. Dr. Hayes, he began, his tone earnest, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life tonight. Even after how we treated you, I'll never forget this lesson. Adrian placed a comforting hand on Ben's shoulder, his smile filled with reassurance. "Sometimes life gives us second chances," he said gently. "What matters is what we do with them." Nearby, Mr. Johnson, the restaurant's owner, observed the exchange. Awe and determination filled his expression as he watched. He realized his establishment had been given a rare and precious opportunity, a chance to redefine its values and purpose. As the last guest departed and the bustling evening came to an end, a sense of calm settled over the restaurant. The tension and unease that had marked the beginning of the night were gone, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and understanding. It felt as though everyone present had been part of something extraordinary, a moment of transformation that would linger with them long after the night was over. Adrian stepped outside into the crisp evening air, pausing on the sidewalk to take a deep breath. The night had been a whirlwind of emotions, far beyond anything he could have anticipated. He let the events of the evening wash over him, his thoughts drifting back to the day before when he had been turned away from this very establishment. The sting of hurt and disappointment he had felt then was still fresh in his memory. But now, standing there, those feelings had been replaced by something far more powerful: hope. A small smile tugged at Adrian's lips as he reflected on how the night had unfolded. What had begun as a simple dinner in his honor had transformed into something far greater, a catalyst for understanding and growth. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the recognition he had received, but for the chance to spark meaningful change. The way the staff had opened their eyes and hearts, the commitments Mr. Johnson had made to implement lasting changes, it all filled Adrian with a profound sense of purpose. As Adrian began his walk home, he reflected on how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he never imagined. He had always believed in the transformative power of compassion, but tonight had shown him just how far-reaching its effects could be. The weight of the day's events settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the responsibility he carried. Adrian knew that his work wasn't just about saving lives in the operating room. It was about inspiring change, breaking down barriers, and showing people the best of what humanity could be. With every step, Adrian felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was grateful for the evening's recognition, yes, but even more so for the opportunity to inspire positive transformation. The night had reminded him, and everyone else, that even in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding, there was always hope for change. In the weeks following that transformative evening, the Silver Lantern underwent a remarkable evolution. True to Mr. Johnson's word, the restaurant began implementing new policies and practices that reflected its commitment to inclusivity and community service. A simple yet powerful sign now hung near the entrance: "All are welcome here." It served as a daily reminder of the night that had changed everything. Inside, the atmosphere shifted as well. The staff, once quick to judge, now greeted every customer with genuine warmth and respect. They also launched a meal donation program, providing free meals twice a week to hospital workers and local shelters. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the restaurant's kitchen buzzed with activity, preparing meals for healthcare heroes and those in need. Adrian often stopped by to volunteer, donning an apron and working alongside the staff. His presence served as a gentle reminder of the night that had set all these changes in motion. The restaurant's transformation inspired others in the community to follow suit, sparking a wave of similar initiatives. The Silver Lantern had become more than just a dining establishment. It was now a beacon of hope and unity. Adrian couldn't have imagined a better outcome, and as he continued his work as a doctor, he carried the lessons of that night with him. A reminder that small acts of compassion could create ripples that changed the world. The Silver Lantern underwent a transformation that went beyond its facade. A prominent new sign hung near the entrance, its elegant script declaring, "All are welcome here." This simple yet powerful message served as a constant reminder to staff and patrons alike of the restaurant's renewed commitment to inclusivity and community service. Inside, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Staff members who had once been quick to judge now greeted every customer with genuine warmth and respect. They had undergone comprehensive training in inclusivity and customer service, learning to look beyond appearances and treat everyone with equal dignity. The restaurant's most notable change, however, was its outreach program. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the kitchen was a hive of activity as chefs prepared meals not just for paying customers, but for hospital staff and those in need. On those days, lines of doctors, nurses, and medical professionals stretched around the block during their lunch breaks. They were met with steaming containers of nourishing food, served with smiles and heartfelt words of gratitude for their tireless work. But the Silver Lantern didn't stop there. They partnered with local shelters and community centers, delivering meals to those struggling to make ends meet. Volunteers arrived regularly to help package and distribute the food, ensuring it reached the people who needed it most. Dr. Adrian Hayes was often among the volunteers. He would don an apron and work alongside the staff, serving meals and chatting with recipients. His presence was a powerful reminder of the night that had sparked the restaurant's transformation. The impact of these initiatives rippled through the community. Inspired by the Silver Lantern's example, other local businesses began adopting their own inclusive policies and community outreach programs. What had once been just a restaurant was now a beacon of hope and unity in the city. As weeks turned into months, Adrian continued his tireless work at the hospital. His days were filled with surgeries, patient consultations, and mentoring young doctors. But there was a new lightness in his step, a renewed sense of purpose that extended beyond the operating room. One sunny afternoon, while making his rounds, Adrian paused at the window of the pediatric ward. Outside, a group of young patients was boarding a bus, their faces lit with excitement. They were heading to the Silver Lantern, a restaurant once known for turning Adrian away. Now it had become a place of warmth and inclusion. The sight brought a smile to Adrian's face. He thought back to the day Mr. Johnson, the restaurant's owner, had approached him with a heartfelt idea. Johnson had asked if the hospital would allow monthly lunches for young patients, and Adrian had eagerly agreed. It was yet another step toward healing and unity within their community. As Adrian continued his rounds, he reflected on the series of events that had led to this moment. The humiliation and pain he had felt that night at the restaurant seemed like a distant memory. In its place was a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected transformation that had unfolded. He thought of Margaret Ellis, whose act of kindness had set everything in motion. She had taken what could have been a moment of bitterness and turned it into an opportunity for growth and change. Adrian made a mental note to thank her again when she came in for her next checkup. Later that crisp evening, as Adrian prepared to leave the hospital, a young nurse approached him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice filled with emotion, "thank you for inspiring the changes in our community. My grandmother has been struggling, but the restaurant's new outreach program has made such a difference for her." Adrian listened, deeply moved by her words. The warmth in his chest grew stronger, spreading through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. As Adrian drove home that night, he reflected on the events of the past weeks. It wasn't just the changes at the restaurant or the gratitude of the community that filled him with joy. It was the realization that his actions, both in and out of the operating room, had created ripples of positive change that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. It was a feeling of deep fulfillment, a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion could inspire transformation. As he parked his car and stepped into the quiet of his home, Adrian couldn't help but smile. He knew the work was far from over, but the journey so far had reaffirmed his belief in the power of kindness. If this story of Dr. Adrian, Margaret, and Mr. Johnson moved you, we invite you to watch the next story we've handpicked just for you. Click here to experience another tale that will touch your heart.